Hello, and thank you for joining us at the launch and first public meeting of new Global Scientific Advisory Group, Climate Advisory Group. We are all facing the same emergency. Climate change is pushing so many parts of the world beyond tipping point, presenting a very real threat to civilization and life as we know it. But what's being done about it? What tangible, effective steps are we taking to solve this global problem that's facing us all? And perhaps crucially, what should we be doing? The Climate Crisis Advisory Group, or CCAG for short, has been created in response to this exact emergency, formed to provide the most comprehensive scientific advice on not only the causes of the crisis, but real solutions for climate repair. Although well documented, discussed, and understood, we are yet to see and take adequate action. It's time for us all to take responsibility. And alongside providing scientific insights and guidance, CCAG has been created to move and encourage policymakers, government officials, and financial heads to address the key problems at the heart of our world's crisis. I'm pleased to say we have a full complement of scientists with us today, and each member has recently played a key role in the creation of the group's first paper, which outlines CCAG's positioning and approach to climate repair. If you're following us on Twitter, head to @ClimateCrisisAG. The link to the paper is available there for your reference. So David, I am now going to pass to you as chair of the group in a moment. And in a moment, you're going to talk us through the paper that's been launched today. But first, can I ask you two questions? First question I'd like to ask you is, as you see it today, what is the biggest challenges that we face in tackling climate change globally? And on a more positive note, what do you hope CCAG can achieve as a group?
Thank you, Addy. I think the biggest challenge we have is reaching out to the public and getting there an understanding of the nature of this climate crisis, and then reaching out through the public. Obviously, the public is a crucial conduit in this process to the political systems of the world, but also to investors, to banks, to public companies, to private companies. We need to reach out to everyone and explain that there is a crisis, but it's a manageable crisis if we get moving very quickly. That's what is not yet happening.
Thank you, Sir David. That's, we need to get the message out, and that's pretty much what this group is. David, walk us through the key points from this paper. And if you could please keep it succinct, so we have plenty of time to get questions from the public and the media. So David, it's over to you.
He's muted.
Dave, are you there? Can you unmute?
I'm unmuted now. That was an accident. I don't know who muted me.
Don't you worry about it. You take it away now.
So we aim to spell out the nature of the crisis, and what is obvious to us all is we also need to spell out very clearly what actions are needed and how quickly they're needed. That's the whole point of this group. And if I could also say, of course, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change exists and has existed for a long time, and many of the people on this group are contributors to IPCC reports, but we can act in a nimble way. We can respond to climate crises that are happening as they happen, and we can also respond to what needs to be done to avert the crisis. What I also want to say is, if we act quickly, we can bring the risks to a manageable level. But when I say quickly, I'm talking about actions taken in the next 5 years being critical to the future of our planet's ability to manage our civilization. So we are going to meet once a month in the public domain, not just up to COP26. Obviously, COP26 is a critical part of the pathway into the future, but we anticipate that we'll go on well into the future, depending on demand for what we produce. Now, let me talk about tipping points. A tipping point is reached as a global heating pushes temperatures beyond a critical threshold. And there are many tipping points around the world. I'm delighted that the IPCC is now grasping the nettle on dealing with tipping points. Difficult because they're not easily predictable in a scientific way. We can talk about the acceleration.
So David, can I just interrupt a second? I think you're just covering your mic a little bit, so we can't hear you that well. Can you just? Yes, that's better.
So basically, when a tipping point is reached, a follow through is an accelerating process. So, for example, I think we could have Tero Mustonen in to talk to us about what is currently happening in northern Finland, where he lives. We know that what is happening is the Arctic sea ice that has been there for so long, protecting that region from the sun's rays during the polar summer, has now left the sea ice, has left roughly 50% of the Arctic Sea open to sunlight. And the net result is temperatures rising frighteningly rapidly. Records above 30 degrees centigrade up in northern Russia. And I think Tero can tell you about current temperatures in Finland. Really frightening, over 30 degrees centigrade from a minus 30 degrees centigrade several months ago. And these tipping points have global consequences. If we follow through with Greenland ice melting, then of course sea levels globally will rise. Every bit of ice on land that melts ends up in the oceans, and sea levels could rise to unmanageable levels if this is allowed to continue. And the other side with tipping points, which is important, is that one tipping point can set off another tipping point around the planet at a lower critical temperature than that tipping point alone would require. So the whole thing complicates with all of these feedback mechanisms. We need to focus heavily on managing the processes, not only to avoid tipping points, but to step in and, if possible, reverse the actions of these tipping points. So when I look at the risks around the world, I mentioned rising sea levels, but I haven't mentioned that the area in Southeast Asia, for example, is at risk in just 30 years' time of losing 4 livable areas. Countries like Vietnam, 90% of Vietnam is now expected to be flooded once a year by seawater, once a year roughly, by seawater. One flooding with seawater of the Mekong Delta, and that whole Vietnam is a delta, one flooding will mean it's no longer in rice production, one of the biggest rice producing countries in the world. And we're going to see the same in Indonesia. Jakarta, underwater this year already. Jakarta is not going to be a livable city in 30 years' time if all of this continues. And we look across at, everyone knows about Bangladesh, and Ade, you reported from Bangladesh, and you were quite terrified by what you saw there. People are being confined to a smaller and smaller area year on year in that part of the world. We're looking at a potential of very large numbers of climate refugees, which I believe would destabilize the global economy. If we look at the Amazon rainforest, natural deforestation, by which I mean not driven by human beings cutting forests down, but by forests dying off due to temperature rises and changes in humidity. We're looking at more wildfires occurring, particularly in North America and Australia, more wildfires occurring driven by the same impact. The point is that the planet has already heated by 1.2 0.25 degrees centigrade above the pre-industrial level. So when we talk about staying within 1.5 degrees to limit the impacts of climate change, we have to say we're rolling forward over 1.5 already, even if we were to reduce emissions to zero in a very short period of time, which we won't do. So what we need in terms of actions, and I will just list them, is first of all, we've got 3 R's: reduce, remove, and repair. Reduce meaning reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And by greenhouse gas, I'm including not only carbon dioxide, but also methane. Methane emissions currently are rising faster than before and are now at a rather frightening level and could be much higher soon. Secondly, remove. We need to bring greenhouse gas levels down. We're currently, if we add in methane and use, we can use a variable figure to compare methane with carbon dioxide, but if we use carbon dioxide equivalent, then it's somewhere between 460 and 508 parts per million, depending on what figure you use. It's already too high. We need to bring that level down to 350 parts per million, and that means we have to learn how to remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere safely and, if possible, mimicking natural processes and improving the world's biosystems while we do it. And finally, the 3rd R is repair. And under repair, we're looking at those systems such as the Arctic Circle region to see whether we can actually reverse the system that has caused the unfreezing of the ice over the Arctic Sea. So that, for me, covers the rather lengthier document that I'm referring to here.
Thank you, David. Thank you for that. And thank you for being so succinct. And of course, if you want to read that document more in detail, head to the Twitter handle and you'll see it. It's at Climate Crisis AG, and you'll be able to explore that document in more detail. Now, we're going to open up the discussion up to questions from members of the media and the public, and we'd ask that each person stick to one question each to ensure that we can get through as many questions as possible. First up, we've got Catherine Brahik from The Economist.
Hi, yes, thanks for that. In your document, you mentioned the need for net zero not by 2050, but before, in fact, well before 2050. I think the date 2035 is even mentioned. It seems ambitious, to put it kindly, to be calling for that. And I was wondering if you could explain not just the justification for that, so why you feel that's needed, but also how you think that's realistic.
Catherine, is that question addressed to Sir David or anyone in the group in particular?
Well, it came from the document, so I don't know who authored that particular part of the document, so I'll leave it to the group.
No worries, no worries. Who would like to take that question? Sir David, okay.
Well, Catherine, thank you very much. Let me address that by first of all saying we're only talking about what is necessary to avert a crisis. And so heading towards net zero, and it is net zero we're talking about, it's not absolute zero emissions, by 2035, 2040, is an objective that creates a potential manageable future for humanity. So this is the first thing to say. The second thing is, you will know that the British government has now committed itself to an interim target. Instead of just 2050 net zero, our target is now 78% reduction by 2035. And the Climate Change Committee of Parliament has set out in detail how we can achieve this relatively painlessly. And I do believe that's a message for all developed nations in the world and emerging economies, because it can be done. we know that the cost of renewable energy systems has come down very significantly. Now, the investment in renewable energy, as distinct from the total electricity production in the whole world, is well over 65%. Right? The reason is because it's a marketable product. It compares well in cost with new installation of coal-fired, gas-fired or oil-fired power stations. So I think it's doable, Catherine, but I also think it's necessary.
Perhaps we could also go over to Professor Yi Qi to give us the Chinese point of view on that, if you'd be so kind, Professor. Can you unmute yourself?
Thank you. Well, last year, September 22nd, the Chinese President Xi Jinping made the announcement at the UN, the 75th Assembly, China will peak its carbon emission by 2030 and to achieve the carbon neutrality by 2060. Well, the 2060, what that means, that's actually consistent, based on the research here in China, that will consistent to the 1.5 degree scenario developed by the IPCC. Right after that, the government now has mobilized at all levels. All levels of the governments are making their plan for achieving the carbon neutrality. Then also all the major companies, particularly the state-owned large SOEs, are now working on their own plans. So this including their action plan, their implementation plan with a timetable. More significantly, China is going to announce, going to start the carbon market within a week. So we're going to see the nationwide carbon market here in China. When it is implemented, it will cover just about 4 billion tons of carbon dioxide within one sector, the power sector. We're talking about a carbon market twice as large as the EU ETS. So these efforts are expected to play a significant role, whether or not they can actually achieve the carbon neutrality by 2060, whether or not 2060 is sufficient for achieving the target that Dave just mentioned, 2035 to 2040 is still remains a question. But this is a major move forward, and it's also a major boost for worldwide for addressing this issue of climate crisis.
Thank you, Professor. And I guess the timetable for addressing the climate crisis is the big key point that the whole world needs to address, and trying to get an agreed date. And we talked about carbon emissions, and so perhaps we can hear from Dr. Klaus Lackner, who's the director of the Center for Negative Carbon Emissions and professor at the School of Sustainable Engineering and Built Environment. Dr. Klaus, what are your thoughts on this? Or can you unmute yourself, please?
Yes, thank you. I always have made an analogy that we are in a car going way too fast down a steep mountain road. And so the question which was raised, there's a sharp curve coming. And I think at this point, we will hit the guardrail. And so the question is, should we really be carbon neutral by 2035? Of course we should, because if we aren't, we have to pick up an awful lot of carbon afterwards. Mm-hmm. The question in my view is, we already see some damages. We hit the guardrail with some stones on the way down, and it's going to get worse. So we need to be ambitious about it, and whether we really make 2035 is the second question, because it's hard. But on the other hand, the question is not, should we give up? Because if the challenge is, will we roll the car or will we just tear the fender off? And I I'm voting for the fender. we need to slow down and as fast as we possibly can, because if you look at the 1.5 scenarios, if we are not carbon neutral by that time window, we start cleaning up afterwards. And if we go back to 350, we certainly have to clean up an awful lot already.
I totally agree, actually. I mean, it's so important that we have this target of 2035, even 2030. Even if we don't achieve it, that's what we should be aiming for, you know. And I definitely don't want to see the guardrail taken off the car as well, Dr. Klaus. Can we also hear from Johan Rockström on this question?
Yeah, I'd like to compliment Sir David and Klaus just by reminding us that of the over 100 climate scenarios of the IPCC that enable us to land with a reasonable probability at 1.5, all of them bend global curves of emissions last year, 2020. We've still not bent. We have only 7-8 years left of the finite carbon budget. So however you twist and turn it, we need to phase out as quickly as possible. And the first step is to cut global emissions by half by 2030. But because we only have half of the number of countries in the world who have even committed to anything like halving by 10 years, of course, we will have a very steep slope to reach carbon neutrality within that bracket 2035 and 2040. However, that's not even enough, because all of these scenarios already have factored in the assumption that agriculture will go from source to sink. It has already factored in that we will be scaling negative emissions by 7-8 gigatons of carbon dioxide per year the second half of this century, and has already factored in this assumption that all the climate carbon sinks that Sir David pointed out do not have tipping points, So we're assuming stability, we're assuming an agricultural revolution, we're assuming negative emissions, and that is what gives us a safe landing at 2050. So this is extremely optimistic. So if you want to have any kind of risk management, to have any kind of guardrail and turning on the lights on that rapidly running vehicle, we better phase out fossil fuels as quickly as we ever can.
Thank you. That's really well put, actually. And hopefully that satisfied your question there. So we're going to move on to our next question, and it's from David Wallace Wells from New York Magazine.
Thanks for having me. I was going to ask the question that Catherine did about 2035 or 2040. So in light of that, maybe for Professor Rockström, Sir Dave mentioned the possibility of reversing some tipping points. I wondered if you could talk about that as a goal, and secondarily, even assuming if we get to net zero by 2035 or 2040, the report also calls for getting to back down to 350 parts per million. And I wonder if Professor Lochner could talk about the scale of negative emissions or carbon removal that would be necessary, even assuming net zero by 2035 to get us down to 350. So first for Professor Rockström about the possibility of reversing tipping points, and then for Professor Lochner about the scale of carbon removal necessary to get us to 350. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, David. Ade, should I simply jump at this?
Yes, go for it.
So thanks, David. This is, as you know, very much in the frontier of science. So there's a lot of challenges still to put the precise temperature thresholds for tipping points. But from the state of knowledge we have today, we, number one, as David pointed out, we have already reached at 1.25 degrees Celsius warming, a point where parts of West Antarctica, Arctic sea summer ice, and tropical coral reef systems have very likely already reached tipping points. My conclusion is that these are not possible to reverse on time scales that are relevant for us. Let's take a 2-3 generation time scale. Then you have a number of tipping points that are at risk. We have mapped 9 out of the known 15 climate tipping elements that are showing signs of approaching tipping points. One of them is, for example, the Atlantic overturning of heat in the North Atlantic, slowing down the whole Gulf Stream. Now, there is science, a paper that came out from Peter Cox et al. At Exeter, showing that we may have a repair opportunity there. If we go across the threshold, it's such a slow tipping point that we may have some regret options if we can rapidly go to negative emissions. But the jury is still out there. But then we have other tipping points that are fast, like, for example, the Amazon rainforest and the permafrost thawing that very likely do not have that regret period, but we don't know exactly where the tipping point is. But I would argue that the scientific assessment of the best bet today is that it's roughly at 2 degrees. So go past 2 degrees, and we are having a high risk of unleashing a number of these tipping points that would not give us a turning back point. But we have a few of these slow ones that there might be some repair options on. And you have some big ones of that category, like the Greenland ice sheet, that we simply don't know. The Greenland ice sheet is a slow tipping point, but once you cross a tipping point, it's the jury's out there whether we have a turn back opportunity. So this is really a really important scientific landscape, but that's why we at the CCAG put a precautionary line in the sand. I mean, why take the risk?
Klaus, would you like to take that question as well?
Yes, I'm coming at this not as a climate scientist, but as an engineer. And my view is, what I learned from all of this is we have to balance the carbon budget, and the sooner the better. And if we balance it too late, we will have to take carbon back. Now, if we are slow, and I do not want to leave the impression that if you do all of that, you got away without any damages. You minimize the damages by doing this, but if you waited, the longer you wait, the larger these damages will be. Now, the scale of having to do this is very large. And I like to tell people, in my own view, there is roughly 40 gigatons a year we will have to deal with in some form or another. And I give you 3 ways of looking at that number. First of all, that's the order of magnitude of what we are emitting from fossil fuels in CO2. I'm not talking about the other greenhouse gases right now. That's the current order of magnitude. A few years ago, I was involved in a paper where we argued the last 20% are very hard. Now, if you let the world's economy grow, and we have to let the developing country catch up with the rest of the world, otherwise we have much bigger problems. And you scale this forward with 2% annual growth in energy consumption to the year 2100, that last 20% is again 40 gigatons, because things grow roughly 5-fold at 2% a year for 80 years. The third one is, I think we have to come back down. And if you say, I'll give you 40 years time to collect 100 ppm out of the air, keep in mind that roughly half of it will have distributed itself into the ocean and the biosphere, and you want to get all of that back, you need about 1,500 gigatons of CO2, maybe 1,600, and divide by 40. That's again 40 gigatons a year. So I see us facing an enormous challenge pulling back carbon dioxide. And the faster we can do that, the faster we can actually get things under control. But of course, we need the reduction of emissions. The faster, the better, because the more we have to mop up, the harder it's going to get.
Thank you, Klaus, and thank you, Catherine and David, for your questions, and Johan for your answer. Let's go on to our next question, which is from Natalia Flores from Brazil and the Bori Agency.
Thank you. I would like to ask the group as the whole group, if somebody wants to answer it. To tackle climate change, it's necessary to engage private sectors, companies, and governments, public administrations as well, all around the globe. In your perspective, which of these two is more difficult to engage for this cause?
Thank you for that question. Perhaps Mercedes Bustamante, would you like to tackle that question first?
Yeah, thank you, Adi. Thank you, Natalia, for the questions. I think that what needs is involvement of all the sectors. I think that public sector is quite important because governments have a very important role to play, but it's not enough. We also need the involvement of the financial sector and the private sector. And this is especially important for the developing countries, because the governments need also to have the support of the investment sector to achieve the mitigation targets. So I think this is a moment now that we need the involvement of the whole sectors of the society, and quite rapidly, as my colleagues mentioned before. Thank you.
Thank you, Mercedes. Would anyone else like to answer this question? Lorraine, perhaps?
Yeah, I'll just have a quick go. I wanted to add as well that as well as the private sector and government, we absolutely need the public to be on board with this as well. And actually, we are seeing that the public are mobilising. They're calling for action by governments and by the private sector. And so they are putting pressure on those groups to act. So already that's, I think, helping provide an impetus for the private sector and the public sector to take action. And I think actually in terms of which group is more difficult to engage with, I think it kind of, you can frame your message in different ways. And actually it's important to emphasize that there are economic opportunities for the private sector in terms of addressing climate change. And so framing your message in that way can be very powerful. And for policymakers, it's also about addressing other policy goals. I mean, improving public health, for example, security, jobs, and the economy, the green recovery from COVID. So it's about tailoring, I think, how we engage with those groups so that we can encourage them to be active. Thank you for that, Lorraine. I also think it's very difficult when you're talking to the public, because there's so much information out there, and trying to disseminate what's right, what's wrong, and where they come in and what part they could play is very difficult. I mean, perhaps Arunoba, perhaps you can take something, answer this question as well, please.
Sure, thank you, Ade, and thank you, Natalia, for that question. I believe it's not an either or, and we've got to figure out the conditions under which investment, policy, and behavior begins to change simultaneously. And I would argue that that would only happen when we pass through every proposition, every project plan, every policy measure through a lens of whether it creates new jobs, additional jobs, brings in additional investment, and is also sustainable. So that trifecta of jobs, growth, and sustainability is really where the action lies. To take specific examples, if you take a country like India, a little over a decade ago, we had less than 20 megawatts of solar power. And now we have more than 95,000 megawatts of solar, wind, and other renewables. With large hydro, it's 140,000 megawatts, with an aim for 450,000 megawatts of renewables by 2030. Now, we are basically creating more renewables than our entire electricity system today. And that wouldn't have happened if that investment opportunity weren't there. That wouldn't have happened if we hadn't created more than 100,000 jobs in this sector. And it wouldn't have happened without that policy signal. But ultimately, we have to bring the energy transition closer to people. While we build big solar parks and wind turbines all over the place, I think when we look at distributed energy, for instance, which creates 7 times more jobs than even utility scale solar, which in turn creates more jobs than coal, we actually bring something that's abstract in terms of climate models, something that's far away in terms of energy policy, to something that becomes here and now and very real for someone with a roof space, or a farmer wanting to put a solar irrigation pump. So bringing the energy transition closer to people would be the way to somehow get to that trifecta of jobs, growth, and sustainability. Great, that's great, Arunoba. Mark, perhaps you could say something on this as well, please.
Thank you very much. I think one of the key questions about the 3 different sectors is how we communicate about the win-win solutions. And I think, again, the problem is that we are always about the doom and the gloom, which again is really pressing. But actually, when we take it apart, when we look at individuals and say, these are the things you can do, and they have positive things. For example, shifting to a more vegetable-based diet improves your health, longevity, at the same time as reducing your carbon footprint. In terms of companies, it's getting that message out that when you look at the Carbon Disclosure Project, they show that companies that actually think about climate change, disclose their carbon, actually are 60% or more profitable than companies that don't. And with government, when we look at all the positive wins, when we can look at, say, cleaning up air pollution by removing fossil fuels, suddenly that's a huge health saving. And what people don't realize, and government doesn't always acknowledge, which is at least 10 to 17% of every country's GDP is on health. And so therefore, any savings that we make is a fantastic saving overall. So I think we need to look at it more holistically, but also this group and other groups need to actually really push that actually there are positive things that individuals, companies, and governments can do, which are win-win and sometimes win as well, which actually improve everybody's life and finances. And I think we need to keep that message going to encourage, because we've seen there are winners, great companies, great governments, and great individuals. But we need the other ones, the laggards, we need to pull them up as well, so we can actually achieve these targets of going carbon net zero by 2035.
Yeah, such a great message there, Mark, because I think that's the thing I tend to find when you're speaking to members of the public about climate change, is it's so much negativity, and it's really hard for them to get involved in it because they're so worried and overwhelmed by the whole thing. So thank you for your answer there. Well, our next question is going to come from member of the public, and this is Trevor Dale.
Hi, thank you very much for taking my question. So my question is, will the scale of change required to address climate breakdown be possible if economic changes are framed by questions like, how are you going to pay for this? And what about the taxpayer?
Okay, perhaps Laura Diaz-Anadon, maybe you could take this question.
Thank you, Ade, and thank you very much, Trevor, for the question. Obviously, it's normal that governments care about what happens to public budgets, but the point of your question is very well taken, and we have a lot of research that shows that emphasizing, mentioning, and designing policies to produce some of these co-benefits that Lorraine and Arunaba and Mark mentioned, related to improved health, improved livelihoods, improved ecosystems, are really essential in both sustaining public support and also getting this public support so that the policy effort which is needed, which is needs to be a big fundamental change in terms of the scale of policy effort to make sure we get these emissions reductions. These things are really effective. So I think we have a lot of evidence right now on these health, green industrial policy, competitiveness, and ecosystems co-benefits. In addition to those, so those are huge co-benefits that we can all reap. There are also the avoided damages that we have discussed in the position paper and that Sir David mentioned at the beginning. And just to finish with one brief, again, a positive thing within this spirit, what we have seen is that, yes, we haven't reduced emissions, in the way we need, but we have seen that the policies that have been put in place over the past 20 or 30 years have led to huge cost reductions in some of the technologies we need to get to net zero that were not predicted by experts, by models, and so forth. So we have had some positive surprises, and this unlocks a lot of green growth opportunities.
Thank you, Professor Laura. Tero, I see you have your hand up there, Dr. Tero.
Thank you, Ari. Just to add to the conversation that we also have to face the question of climate change impacts as a what I would call security issue. If we think of what happened on 9/11 and the subsequent consequences of those events on global system and how countries started to respond and so on, I think one of the difficulties in trying to frame climate change impacts as security issues puts us to make some very hard choices. For example, in the Arctic, where most of my work has been, we are now already witnessing evacuation of whole towns like Shishmaref in Alaska because of coastal erosion, lack of sea ice, flooding events in Alazeya River in Siberia, hence the term, the first climate refugees in Siberia, and so on in the higher latitudes. how do we respond to those things in practice, and who has the capacity to respond? Well, it often drops down to the military forces and highly quickly deployable units that can respond if there's a very big crisis suddenly. And who can plan for such events? I think those are pretty profound questions, and we have seen so little capacity to prepare and make emergency plans when the things get worse.
Hero, thank you for that. It's sobering thought, and it makes you think how much we still have left to do. Dr. Klaus Lucknow, would you like to take this question as well, please?
Yes, I am coming from an engineering perspective, and yes, it will cost you money to clean up after yourself. And in many ways, certainly the CO2 aspect of the problem I see as a waste management problem. We have decided 200 years ago it's okay to dump all that CO2 into the atmosphere, and we have now learned we cannot do this anymore. So we have to first clean up what we do, and then we have to probably clean up what we did. But put it in cost perspective. If you look at some of the people who try to do air capture, they all come down saying we can do it below $100. If you say the overall cost of reducing carbon emissions and greenhouse gases comes out as an equivalent of $50 a ton of CO2, because some things are cheaper than others, that would add to the price of gasoline, or the equivalent of oil, roughly $20 a barrel. We can pay for that. We know we can pay for that because the price of oil has gone up and down by far more than that, and the world did not come to an end. So yes, it will cost money, but somebody also will build $1 trillion industry in order to clean up, because we are talking about $40 times 40 gigatons. So this is an industry as large as the aviation industry, and it's spread over very many different things too. It's not just air capture, it's not just one thing. But these are industries which have revenues in the order of $1 trillion, which puts them at par with building cars, still small compared to the energy sector, and on par with aviation. There are opportunities here. It's not just we have to fix a disaster, and we have to learn to clean up after ourselves.
Thank you, Dr. Klaus. I always find it interesting when we talk about money, and you kind of makes me think, can we put a price on securing the future of humanity? I mean, it's crazy when you look at it that way. But thank you for the question, Trevor. I hope we've answered it for you. And let's move on to our next question. And this is from the media, Ben Spencer from the Sunday Times.
Hi. There was talk at the beginning of this session about reaching out to the public and keeping the public on board. Now, so far as in our efforts to tackle climate change, it hasn't really affected people's lives much. We've built wind farms out at sea, we've closed coal power stations. For me, my family, my friends, my relatives, that has impacted us at all. When we talk about the next stages, telling me I need to buy a different car, I need to change the way I heat my house, I perhaps have to change the way I eat food, the food I eat. That's a big change for me and will be a big change for everyone. How do we keep the public on board? Could I ask Lorraine, as an environmental psychologist, if she'd answer that?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that, and I think that's a really important point, Ben. And you flag the fact that the progress we've made today has basically been in terms of energy supply, so moving towards more renewable sources of energy, and the public haven't seen a lot of that. They haven't been directly involved in that change, whereas what we see now is that it's going to be very much affecting people's lives. I think in order to kind of get people on board with those changes, I think there needs to be more opportunities for the public to feed into decisions about how we reach our climate targets and our net zero targets. So at the moment, we're seeing this explosion of things like citizens' assemblies and citizens' juries. And I think those are one way in which the public can have a much more substantive voice in decision making about how to tackle climate change. And what we're seeing coming out of those processes is a very clear message that the public does want us to reach these targets. They do want ambitious action, and they're willing to play a big role in that. So they're willing to change their lifestyle, but they do want support in those changes. So they want it to be easier, affordable, the barriers removed to lifestyle change. And so I think that means that then they're calling on governments and businesses to also play a role and to facilitate lifestyle change and to provide the products and services that are lower carbon. So I think the public is increasingly on board. I think they're being given a voice to say what how we should take action. But they also they're saying they need help, and they need kind of the regulations, the incentives, and all the policy and other measures to enable them.
Lorraine, what do you think the CCAG's job is in terms of giving the public a voice? Is there anything we can do to help the public with that voice?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's great that these meetings are public, so that then the public can come in and ask questions. I think that's one thing that is, I think, a really great opportunity. But I think also it's our job as a group to then highlight what needs to happen to enable people's lifestyles to change, to facilitate broader social change, to achieve these co-benefits that improve people's lives, as well as tackling climate change. Because I think that's another thing we know, is that the public are particularly keen to support change where it will do other things to improve quality of life as well. So we need to be, I think, bringing in all that evidence about what the public wants to the messaging that we're giving as well.
Thank you, Lorraine. Mark, would you like to come in on this as well?
Certainly, and thanks for your question, Ben. I think also we underestimate the public, okay? If we look at changes that have happened in the past, seatbelts coming in, no smoking on the underground trains, the congestion zone in London. I remember people writing in newspapers that this was the end of Western civilization, the idea that you had to pay to go with your car into central London. And we've seen with COVID that people adapt very, very quickly. And I think this is the thing that we, as humans, we hate change, okay? And absolutely, I'm with you. But actually, people adapt very quickly. So once electric cars come in, everybody go, I have no idea why we ever had petrol ones. These are so much nicer. I've got friends who can afford a Tesla. I can't. Who basically go, it's the best car I've ever had. Oh, this is amazing, okay? So I think we sometimes underestimate the public and how quickly society can adapt to changes. And actually, there are so many things that companies and governments can do to actually make it easier. So I'm going to steal an example, and please correct me if I'm wrong, from Finland. They have made it that all your electric tariffs are green. Now, if you want to opt out of that, and it might be slightly cheaper, you can. And so I think sometimes we need to allow the public to do the right thing, because they're incredibly busy. They have incredibly busy lives, okay? They've perhaps got 1 or 2 jobs. They're trying to get their kids to school on time. They're trying to do homework. Don't talk to me about homework, okay? But at the same time, at the back of their mind, they'd love to save the planet. And so again, I think we need to help them and encourage them. I think this group here can actually encourage governments and companies to actually facilitate those solutions that allow the public to do what we want them to do.
Thank you for that answer, Mark, and thank you for the question as well. We've got some more questions to go through, but our time's running short, so let's get through these quickly. Let's go to Ernie Goswami from the Economic Times of India.
Hello. So my question is very simple. Science and your report just sort of buttresses that the situation is dire. Emissions have to be reduced drastically and rapidly. We have seen the wealthier countries putting out policies and laws that are an effort in this direction. Of course, the jury is out on whether it's adequate or it represents a fair share, but that's a different question. But basically, if I look at the EU, US, and the UK, we are talking about 35 to 40%, and I'm not putting in China because that's a political intent. But let's say even if even if you put that, we are talking of anywhere between 35 to 60% of the global economy taking a drastic turn towards net zero, even if it's by 2050. But it's still, so basically what that means is that other countries will, in an enlightened self-interest, fall in line, because that's where the economy is going. And that's where the global economy is going. So fine, we may need to, as the report puts it, maybe accelerate the speed, do the things that need to be done. But I'm wondering whether we have forgotten in this mix and the question of fairness and equity. I know there's a mention of equity, one mention of equity in the report, but the fact of the matter remains that India is a country that will put up, as Arunava mentioned, 450 gigawatts of renewable energy by 2030, or it aims to. It's also a country that has developed its own COVID vaccine, but it's also a country when in 2019, 80% of the rural households did not have a tap in the house. So basically no potable water in the house. So that's a reality. And in all the conversation that I've heard till now, it's almost as if the developing world is missing. And I'm wondering, is equity a dead subject in the net zero world? Is the situation so dire that we have to throw out equity?
Great question there, Ami. And I can see Professor Lavanya Rajamani has got a hand up for this one. And perhaps Dr. Arunova can take the question afterwards as well. So Lavanya, if you go first.
Thank you, Ade, and thank you, Urmi, for that really terrific question. Equity is not dead, and we cannot achieve what we need to achieve without equity and fairness. It is crucial going forward, and I think it's a sine qua non of anything that we do. And I think this is quite simply not just for ideological reasons, it's also for just sort of pragmatic reasons. If we need everybody to be on board, every country needs to feel a sense of investment and ownership in the direction that we're going in. So we cannot achieve this without equity and fairness, and without an understanding of the fact that different countries are going to do this differently, are going to come to it at different times, and are going to need different kinds of support to do so. So that's a starting point, I think, and I think we're all on board with that central message. Now, how that's going to be done is, of course, a trickier question. The Paris Agreement certainly sort of endorses this approach and endorses fairness and equity. Article 4.1 of the Paris Agreement very clearly recognizes that peaking of emissions will happen later in developing countries, and that net zero has to be achieved on the basis of equity and in the context of sustainable development and poverty eradication. However, the Paris Agreement itself fails to fully operationalize equity in its provisions. There are a few hooks to do so. The global stocktake, which is scheduled for 2023, is one hook where equity can be operationalized. And the other hook is for states to offer narratives of fairness and equity and ambition when they sort of introduce their nationally determined contributions. Now, I think going forward, there are a couple of different ways in which equity and fairness can be mainstreamed. For one, I think in the narratives that we adopt, not just as a group, but beyond. I think when we talk about net zero, we're not talking about a uniform, undifferentiated net zero at the same point for every single country. There is some understanding that different countries will come to it differently and at different time points, and that some countries might need to go further faster to allow other countries to get there a little later. That's the first point I'd like to make. The second point is the global stocktake under the Paris Agreement could certainly be fully operationalized to have a robust assessment of equity, so that at the next stage, we actually have NDCs that it catalyzes NDCs that are fairer. The third avenue, interestingly, is actually national litigation. National courts and even regional courts are beginning to ask this question of fair shares. Many recent cases, including the German sort of constitutional court decision in April, the Urhenda case a few years ago, have asked this question of what is each country's fair share? Because when climate litigants go to court and ask the court to determine that that country's contribution, climate contribution, is not sufficiently ambitious, automatically the court asks, now how do we determine whether something is adequate sufficiently ambitious in the context of a global climate collective action problem. And so the question of fair shares has cropped up in litigation, and different courts are actually looking at it and coming to different conclusions on this. So equity, to conclude, is not dead. It is sort of central to the Paris Agreement architecture. It is central to the narrative on net zero, and it is central to many of the cases that are sort of emerging in developed countries and regional courts as well. So I'd like to leave it there, but I know that there are plenty others who have views on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Lavanya. Dr. Aranova, would you like to take that as well, please?
Sure. Thank you, Urmi, for that question. First, we have to recognize that while there is an equation that says we need to race to zero for the planet, any race is not won by all participants all at the same exact time. And that means whether we aim for net zero by 2050 or we aim for net zero by 2035 or 2040, if that's when the planet has to get to zero, that means those who've contributed more to the pollution thus far should be getting to zero before that date. That leaves some time for the others to get to zero a little after that date. Europe and the UK will have more than 70 years between peaking their emissions and getting to net zero. China will have 30. It is being demanded of India to have only 20, right? So we have to understand that, you know, this is a pizza party where you open the box and 6 of the 8 slices have already been eaten up. And then you say, well, everyone gets an exact share. That doesn't work. However, there's another way to look at the equity issue. And that is the issue of development. And the fact that technologies that have already been developed and the technologies that are being developed, unless we bring the developing countries into a conversation of what development pathways would look like, we end up otherwise with a techno-mercantilist world, where the future might still be green, but all the intellectual property still rests in a subset of the world's countries. So how do we create the genuine collaborative platforms for co-developing the low carbon technologies, for getting the investment to flow where the sun shines the most and the wind blows the hardest, at the cost that is equivalent to the same cost at which you will get debt in Norway? Can Bangladesh get debt at the same price? It's when you create those arrangements that developing countries will see, well, yes, even though I have only 2 pizza slices left, I'm being brought into a conversation which is making me a participant in this. Otherwise, we are, you know, creating a narrative where we want the world's poor to be audiences for our climate speeches rather than partners in reimagining a very different form of development.
Thank you for that answer, Umi. That was a really, really good question. And I know many of the board members would like to get in there, but we've got a few more questions to get up. So maybe we'll finish off with Mercedes, if you wanted to answer that question.
Oh, thank you, Adi. I think it's really a very good question. And I think equity and sustainability are strictly linked and should be the basis of the new economy we are talking here about. But I would also like to stress that it also involves the respect to the different visions of the world and the respect to the rights of indigenous and traditional communities in the developing world. I think they must be considered in this equation, and we should take into account the different world visions. This is an important part of the solution. Thank you.
Thank you, Mercedes. Maybe one more answer. Dr. Bob Carell, would you like to take this question as well? Are you on mute?
Thank you very much. I'd like to pick up the thematics of the last several questions, if I might. It seems to me that there's a balancing act underway, and we should be more optimistic. Let me tell you why. In the banking industry, there's a great deal of conversation about the role the banks play in providing the tools by which we can do the energy transformation. I think everybody here knows that Jamie Dimon has come on like a tiger with an offer of over $2.5 trillion of investment in alternative ways in which we can build this. There's discussion in the Fed in the United States and the European Central Bank about the role the banks play. And it seems to me they are fundamental because they are the tools by which the energy transformation will take place, because that's where the money is, to put it bluntly. Secondly, there's a new kind of conversation. Let me give you an example. The Arctic Council has met just recently, and it's a ministerial meeting of the ministers of foreign affairs and included our Secretary of State. For the first time, they really came down very hard on this issue that we all have to work together. Well, when you get those kinds of political peoples talking in a new kind of language, we can begin to see the balancing act among the David's three R's: repair, remove, and reduce. And finally, there's stuff going on in industry. I think most of you have tracked what's going on this past week at Exxon, but I think it's even deeper than that, where companies are saying, we are going to have to move out of this energy system that depends totally on fossil fuels. I have a good example where one of the big supply companies in Houston that provides pipe and all the other sorts of things have decided they will get out of that business and get into the supply business for the energy transformation. So I see a balancing act that gives us some hope, but we on this committee and all of you out there in the public, we need to help those folks who are working to realize that that we're at their backs. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you, Ernie, for that question. It sparked up so much interest. We could have done a whole hour on the question of equity and climate change in itself. But I just want to let you know we're running over slightly, but we're going to continue because we've still got a few more questions we want to get through. I'm going to go to Felicia Jackson from Forbes, please.
Sorry about that. I was just trying to unmute. I think my real question is, what is it the group is doing differently that is going to change the trajectory of how politicians take action?
Great question, Felicia. I think I'd throw that over to Sir David, actually.
Well, thank you, Ade, and thank you for a really good question. I think the answer is, you might have noticed listening to the answers that people have given, is that we have an expert group here that could hardly be paralleled by any other group, I suspect. And what this means is that we are able publicly to give answers to the media, answers to political figures, investors, etc., to the various important questions that are fundamental to this whole process. The other point is, if you name another body that matches this, many people say to me, isn't this what the IPCC does? No, the IPCC doesn't have an expert group. Many of these people here are contributors to the IPCC, doesn't have an expert group available to the public in this way. So I think we can act nimbly, we can act with agility in a way that certainly the IPCC group fails to do for very good reasons. I'm not critical of them at all. But we are a different sort of body. We're agile, we can respond to issues as they are seen to arise. And the other point I want to make is we're running out of time. We have been discussing through the IPCC since 1992 how to manage this crisis. So a new parameter.
Oh, you've just frozen, Sir David. But yes, I mean, we'll go back to Sir David once he's sorted his line out. But I think Nerily, you want to try answering that question as well.
Yeah, and I think actually I wanted to pick up on pretty much where Sir David was at. In the what I see that this group can be is we can be very responsive and we are in a situation where we've let this problem go on to a point where we really don't have time to spare. We've got these great systems that we've set up like the IPCC, but each of those systems takes many years to actually work through a process, and we just don't have that time available to us now. And so what I hope that this group can do is to get messages out much more quickly and actually sort of help to catalyse that urgent action that we really need to take across the world.
Thank you, Professor Neroli there. And we are still waiting for Sir David to come back. But whilst we wait for his line to come back, we'll get our final question from Martin Yule, who's a member of the public. Martin, take it away.
Good afternoon, Ade. Well, I'm going to cut my question right to the chase, right? The question I originally wanted to ask was, will the CCAG address the relationship between climate change and population health pandemics like obesity? Let me make that more blunt a question. Will CCAG take on board a public health professional or two to contribute to the discussions?
Big question. Thank you for that question, Martin. I think, should I go to Martin on this? Oh, no, Mark on this, sorry. Mark, what's your thoughts? Can you unmute yourself, please, Mark?
I fell for it as well. You know, it doesn't matter how often you use Zoom, that whole unmute. So Martin, brilliant question. And absolutely, human health is at the cornerstone of all of these debates, whether it is looking at climate change, whether it's looking at biodiversity issues, whether it's looking at environmental damage. Human health underlines this. So I've been very fortunate that I've been part of the Lancet Commission on Global Health and Climate Change, and we will be feeding that in. So 2 or 3 weeks before every COP meeting, there is a huge report that's published in the Lancet, the medical journal, which shows about 100 different indexes of how we're doing with the links between climate change and health. So absolutely, this whole understanding of human health and well-being will feed into this group. And I think it also answers some of the other questions which were about finance, about how we want to have economic growth. Economic growth is only ever any good if it actually increases the well-being of your population. Increasing wealth just for the 26 billionaires who actually have the same wealth as the bottom half of the global population isn't economic growth that we want. And so I think we are very aware of making sure that equity, making sure that the poorest in the country can actually be raised up. I think in the world, I think these are all central discussions. And I look around this group and there are such experts in these fields that I feel that we will take on the global health crisis on board at the same time as we deal with climate change, environmental destruction, and of course, future pandemics. I hope that helps.
I've done it now as well. Thank you, Mark. That was a really, really good answer. Does anybody else want to take on this question on public health and climate change? Anyone else in the group? Well, I think it's a really good, poignant place to end. Felicia and also Martin, thank you for those last two questions. Yeah, I think there is no point in us trying to address climate change if we're not trying to address public health as well. They go hand in hand. It's all about us and the progress of the human race. So I just want to thank you all for joining us for this first meeting of the Climate Action Group. Thank you very much to our Climate Crisis Advisory Group members and to all of you watching at home. We really appreciate your support. You can learn more about the Climate Advisory Group on their website at ccag.earth. And you can also follow the Climate Crisis Action Group on Twitter and on Instagram at Climate Crisis AG. So please do continue to send us questions for the next public meeting in July. Thank you for joining us today, and we really look forward to seeing you at the next meeting on Thursday, the 29th of July, and starting this journey towards climate repair. Thank you and have a great day.